going to bring our panelists up, I guess, right? So come on up. We've got Kate Fitzgerald, who worked with us in the Texas Department of Agriculture. She started when she was 4 years old. That's why she's still so young. And then she went on to found the Sustainable Food Center in Austin, which runs 3 or 4 farmers markets and does all sorts of good work. And she is now working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in their new Regional Food Business Center. So that encompasses the production, but also the marketing and all aspects of agriculture. So Kate is with us. We've got Christine Dominguez Eshelman, there she is, who is with La Semilla, based out in the El Paso area, which means she deals not only with Texas, but with New Mexico as well. You know, El Paso is closer to 5 other state capitals than it is to Austin. 2 of them are in Mexico, but they feel lonely out there sometimes. And she is the leader, the co-founder and executive director of La Semilla Food Center, and runs the La Semilla Community Farm out there. And we have Tanya Chavez Camacho. See? Yeah, good. Yeah, with La Union del Pueblo Entero. And she was born in Mexico, came here to McAllen, I believe it is, when she was 14 years old, and just not very long ago, 2020 I think it is, became a full-fledged citizen of the United States of America. No, not yet. Okay, all right, we'll hear about that. And then became the executive director of Lupe and of Lupe Vote, the Political Action Committee as well. So here is our panel today. Welcome them. And Alex will run the show.
Hello. Okay. Well, thank you, Hightower, for just a really nice, inspirational kickoff to this second day of the Food Summit. For those of you guys who have been with us the last couple of days, you've seen that we've covered a variety of topics, ranging from a vibrant discussion around farm worker rights and the struggle for farm workers on Wednesday at the Museum of South Texas History. Yesterday we saw and was inspired by a number of presenters around community action, community-based organizations, and cooperation around food systems. And then we also heard from a youth panel that frankly stole the show about, and their inspiring work and perspectives about food, agriculture, careers, and the future of those students. And today we're focusing our morning panels on action around the state, municipal level. We're talking a little bit later about policies here in the Rio Grande Valley. And we have the pleasure of having our panelists here to talk about food access in Colonias. And so I'd like to welcome everyone here, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction. So we're going to start off with some of the questions that we've prepared, but just to give you guys a little bit of context, as you guys heard, Jim mentioned that Kate runs a program around regional food business centers, which came out last year. And they had a grant program that they're still finishing in their review, so she can't reveal any hints of who might get that. But we are here to talk about the kind of theme around food access and prosperity in these communities, and so we want to ask a set of questions around that. So Kate, as Jim mentioned, you've been working on this your whole career. And I know this, that you know, this is one of your stints with the federal government. Before that, you were at the Sustainable Food Center, and of course, advocating in different capacities in your career, pushing for food access and food security. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience, what you've seen, what you've worked on throughout the years, and how that passion brought you to the USDA? And of course, how that experience that you have and the worldview you've developed over your career, how that integrates into your work in your current role.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And Hightower, I think, was a little bit humble because I joined USDA in 1986. He was elected in 1982, which was, the state was still recovering from the farm crisis. And on the row of offices in which I sat, there was the farm worker representative and also the farmer suicide hotline. So it's hard, I think, today to remember 40 years ago just how very different the environment was in agriculture in Texas, but also in food access in Texas, because this was the time of the invention of leveraged buyouts and hedge funds for the first time coming into urban communities, buying locally owned grocery stores, closing the ones that had lower profitability and expanding to stores in suburbs. It was also the time of Walmart's expansion into rural America, which was undermining food access and closing grocery stores in smaller rural communities. So what the best job I ever had, honestly, was being hired by the Texas Department of Agriculture, because what was being articulated then, starting with leadership, was this notion of a sustainable food system, that farmers and consumers are in it together, that we all live as part of the same economy, and we have to have programs and government supports that protect and preserve the viability of small and mid-sized family farms while providing and ensuring access to healthy food that is accessible to all Texans at that point and now Americans. So I think it was that vision, honestly, that got me started. And what I learned in the time that I remained in the Texas Department of Agriculture, which was until Rick Perry was elected and ended the food system programs, was that the tremendous both power and responsibility that goes with working for government. And I think that Hightower imbued in all of the staff this notion of public service. We worked for the people, and there was no higher calling than to work for an institution of government in a democracy. And the notion of responsibility and the notion that all of us had to be engaged with the people that had elected him and then us to do our utmost to meet their needs. So that was really why I joined USDA, because it feels like in the intervening 35 years, what seemed like radical ideas in the 1980s have become part of institutionalized thought. TDA started the first statewide certified organic program. The woman who ran that program then went to the national level, wrote the national legislation, and led the national organic standards program, and eventually became Deputy Secretary of Agriculture. It may seem to those of you who are new in the field that why weren't these problems all fixed, right? You guys have been at it for 30 years. What's the problem? Well, honestly, there's been a tremendous amount of change. We would have never been doing what we are able to do now if it hadn't been for these incremental steps bit by bit over the years. And for those of you who sometimes lose faith in the institutions, and I would put into that not just government institutions, but for example, our universities. Those institutions belong to us. And by engaging with them, we can change the trajectory of their work. I think UT Rio Grande Valley is a prime example of that. So the reason I came to USDA was because I feel as though with this administration and after the experiences of COVID, there is a seminal moment. And for the first time, there is an acceptance and an understanding by Congress that something went drastically wrong with the food system when COVID hit. The idea that you could just not buy meat or not buy toilet paper, although toilet paper is not part of the food system, but you get my point, right? And now that food inflation is taking a bite out of everybody, that the strains for the first time became apparent in a crisis. And sometimes it takes a crisis to be able to move forward. And so what happened was Congress allocated money to USDA very explicitly, fix the food supply chain. And what the department has done is allocate funds to specific programs designed to meet the specific gaps that became apparent. So following on the idea of being a public servant, hired to do just one little job, and we'll see if we can make some progress with that and this opportunity we have.
Well, I'm so glad and that you're in that position because, of course, there's a lot of opportunity now, as you mentioned, to work with community partners and to target certain areas that have been that are identified, for example, in the Regional Food Business Centers program that have been largely underserved or underinvested. Now, Christina, I'm going to ask you a question. As part of your work with La Semilla, you guys advocate for food access to these communities that have been underinvested in and underserved. I was hoping you can tell us a little bit more about your organization, who it serves, and how you decide to collaborate with, and the strategies you and your organization employs to actually accomplish that work.
Okay. Thanks. Good morning. Buenos dias. So La Semilla is in Anthony. Our office is in Anthony, New Mexico. I live in Anthony, Texas. So I could have one foot in, and I'm from El Paso. And we are working on fostering a sustainable, fair, healthy food system in the Paso del Norte region of southern New Mexico and El Paso. And we are a hybrid organization of frontline programs and also policy and advocacy. And we do that work through 6 programs and 3 fellowships and a bunch of other stuff that there's not time to talk about. And our 6 programs are community education, and my compañera Anaí is here with that program. Edible education, we work with 3 school districts and 30 schools across the region on both sides. And then our La Semilla Community Farm, which is the heart of La Semilla and my heart. And we have an agroecological farming and training program there, so we have a 6-month farmer fellowship. They're out there in the field right now, learning and growing food. And then we have a Farm Fresh program, which aggregates from small producers in the region and provides technical assistance. So we'll source to schools when we can. We have a food box program that can be purchased. It's accessible through SNAP and Double Up food box. Those boxes also go through our edible education program and our community education program to different members in the community. And then our policy and planning program and our storytelling program, which works on narrative shift for transformational power. Can you?
I was wondering, so with the strategies that you use, and how do you decide who you collaborate with? Because I know that you have a lot of partners and community that reaches out to La Semilla for different help, and we've talked about bandwidth before, and how do you decide who you work with, and then, of course, how you work with them?
We decide very carefully and with a lot of intention and a lot of hard conversations, and acknowledging like the tensions in what does alignment look like, and there's like perfectionism, and then there's like incremental steps to get to where you're trying to go. So that's the honest answer. I wouldn't love to tell you. I feel like I'm supposed to be like, there's a matrix and we have this criteria, and like we talk about developing that. We have elements of that, and then the reality is like you have to decide in your context at the time and what's like the capacity of the people that you're going to write into that funding that are going to do these things. Like, are you going to burn them out, or are you going to burn yourself out? And so yeah, it's a collective decision. Also, La Semilla has had, we practice shared leadership, and we've had co-directors up until 2021, where I became the sole executive director. But I've always been a part of a shared leadership team, most recently with another brown femme, and so that was like a really healing, powerful experience. But I like to think, and that's when you have positional power, you have to be careful stating this, but I like to think like our team practices shared leadership still. And there's a lot of decision making made by our different programs about what can be done. It's not like hierarchical at the top, and I'm going to decide. And so when we delve into where we were deliberating on the RFBC, that definitely played a role.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask Tanya. Tanya, from our various interactions, UTRGV working with Lupe, I'd really admire the process that you guys use, the very democratic and participatory approach that you use to prioritize the issues that Lupe, the organization, tries to tackle. I was wondering, for those who didn't make it to Wednesday's film, could you talk about this process? How do you guys decide the eight priorities that you have in the Cumbre of Lupe in 2022, and it's all on the website? And I wanted to ask also, because looking over them, you have some very targeted priorities, but how are some of the basic needs like access to food and safe living conditions? How are they included in some of the priorities? I know that they kind of fit into certain things, but I was hoping you could address some of that here.
How many of you know about Lupe, La Unión del Pueblo Entero? Majority of you. Great, thank you. If you don't, follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and become a member. Why? We do have a very participatory community engagement work that we do at Lupe. You can find our centers throughout the Rio Grande Valley, and you can become a Lupe member and have access to this wealth of services. However, the core of Lupe is really at the Colonias, at the unincorporated areas around Hidalgo, Cameron, Star, and Willacy County. Why do we work in the Colonias? Because that is where the community of Lupe, that is where the Lupe members live, majority of them, not all of them. We also have a lot of members living in the cities. However, where we go, where the community tells us there's a greater need. And so that greater need has been identified at the Colonias. And we do this by really having a house meeting model and using the teachings of Fred Ross, Rebecca, Arturo, and others who have led this legacy of farm worker organizing. And we really ask people, what are your needs? So one colonia might be working on infrastructure light, another one might be working on drainage, you name it. We have even worked with UTRGV to take the farming beds to the colonias. And so it just really depends what the need is in each community. Now, we also have to think, we need to get real, right? That having access to healthy food is expensive. Gas is expensive. I don't see HEB building somewhere in like the middle of the colonias north of Donna and Mercedes. If anybody needs to drive to a Walmart or to an HEB, they have to make a 30-minute drive if you live in Colonia. But that's not the case if you live in McAllen in the city. You can find one within 10 minutes. And so when you really talk about like needs and why we organize where we organize, it's because our community members going to really organize towards having a farmer's market or some crops near their neighborhood where they can, when they're literally canoeing out of the neighborhood when it rains. Like, there's levels of priorities, right? And that's part of like the necessity that has taken us to do this work in the colonias. Now, some colonias, because now I joke with Joaquin and the team that he organizes, I'm like, oh man, we're organizing in bougie colonias. And it's not that they're bougie colonias, it's that we have made them bougie through the work of Lupe, right? They used to not have paved roads. They used to not have electricity. They used to not have dignified housing. Now they do. And they look like a neighborhood like in North McAllen. But that is the work of organizing over a period of years. And so when you talk about the work that we do at Lupe and having a shared community power, we bring those colonia organizations, we survey them over the course of 6 months. We narrow down the priorities that they have in each neighborhood, and we bring them to a convention that we call Colonia Summit or Cumbre de Colonias. And we bring representatives from every single one of those neighborhoods to advocate about the issues that they prioritize over the course of 6 months. And that's how we develop our agenda, which is the legislative agenda that we're organizing with or against at the Texas legislation right now. So I don't believe in systems. I believe that you either work outside the system to get what you need, you work with the system if they want to work with you, or you work to break the system and develop your new system. And so, I mean, that's really what we do at Lupe. We're happy to sit at the table with elected officials if they're willing to negotiate with us. we're also happy to protest them outside their offices and remove them from office if we need to.
It's actually, it was very educational for a lot of those who participated on a Wednesday, watching Lupe, and of course, not just the current work of Lupe, but all of the work that happened since the 1960s to kind of bring Lupe to where it is today. In fact, I was talking to some community members from Lupe that came, and they were like, "We need everyone to see this so that we know where we came from." Because it's not, and it's not just to be educated, but to be empowered by the generations of people who have continued that same voice and that same vision. Now, the programs through your office, Kate, that you offer, including the Regional Food Business Centers program that was announced last year, are intended in part to drive economic prosperity across various regions, and in particular with a focus in Colonias, right? And so when we read the proposal, we saw that they even included a link to the U.S. The Office of the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, where they list where the Colonia regions are. As you know, of course, almost 40% of all colonias are here in the Rio Grande Valley, and then the other big concentration is in the El Paso region. I was wondering if you could just tell us what the impetus, if you can explain what the impetus for including colonias specifically in that program, as it's properly named in that program, and what was the vision for helping colonias in particular for that program?
Honestly, let me see. Yes. So can I just give a quick summary of what the Regional Food Business Center concept is? Okay. So my colleague Sarah and I are here, and we were hired I joined USDA in September. Sarah joined, I think, in December. And we are hired just to work on one program, which is called the Regional Food Business Center program. There's no shared management or shared leadership at USDA. It's pretty darn hierarchical. So just to be clear, we live within an agency called the Agricultural Marketing Service. There are other agencies within USDA, particularly most important to you all is probably Rural Development and maybe the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. But the agency we're in, Agricultural Marketing Service, does provide a variety of kinds of grants that organizations down here like LATSAMI and UTRVG have used. The one particular program that we have is one-time funding, or that we work on is one-time funding. It is not a grant, it's a cooperative agreement, which means what USDA is going to do is to partner with organizations around the country that will then set up virtual centers to provide a variety of kind of services, and their mandate is to improve farm and food business income, viability, and sustainability in their region, with a particular emphasis on investing in communities and producers and businesses that have historically been underinvested in by USDA. USDA, once these organizations are chosen, there is an award, and then Ag Marketing Service, for whom we work, will cooperate with these organizations in doing the work, and their funding will last for 5 years. Every center will have a staff person. So for the first time, this is super exciting, for the first time the Agricultural Marketing Service is actually going to have a staff outside of DC, out there in the trenches, whose mandate is to be a liaison to help provide and make easily accessible all of the USDA programs to the folks working on the ground. I think this is actually the first program that USDA has ever done with an explicit target on the Colonias region, and it is hugely important, and I hope it's historic and sets a precedent for the way programs go moving forward. The USDA has announced that there will be 4 definite centers funded: a National Tribal Center, which will be mandated to provide service to all of Indian country; a center to serve Appalachia; a center to serve the Southeast and Delta, and those are both regions that generally and nationally get attention and resources because it's well understood just how historically underserved they've been. But for the first time, there will be a center dedicated to the Colonias. USDA has defined that as beyond just the Rio Grande Valley and El Paso, all the way through New Mexico, Arizona, and the Imperial Valley of California. But it is a really, I hope, impactful and exciting new development. And while this funding will expire over the course of the next 5 years after these centers are up and working, there will then be a framework and the power invested here and in these communities to be able to keep the work sustained going forward. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. So Tanya, let me ask you, how does Lupe see these kinds of opportunities like the ones that Kate just mentioned in terms of advancing the priorities of Colonias, the priorities that you guys represent? And what are ways that you think Lupe could be more integrated and involved in any proposal or even the creation of these programs as an organization, member organization that represents a broad constituency?
One of the things that I think it shows a good faith effort, but in showing a good faith effort, oftentimes we miss a lot of the nuances on how we go about implementing a program like such. You talk about it being a digital center. Right? Did you say it?
No, just virtual, meaning there's not going to be one office.
Right,
They're
virtual.
dispersed among
So,
organizations.
virtual for Colonias. There's no internet access in the Colonias, right? I don't see computer centers in the Colonias for Colonia residents to be able to get on a computer. You know, during 2020, during the pandemic, we are not a charity organization, and we really had to do really hard decisions in 2020 to become that during the pandemic, because we were providing stipends for people to get in a hotel during the freeze. We were providing cards for them to get groceries at the supermarkets. We were providing computers because families were responding to homework for their kids via cell phone. And so many of the, like last week, the Department of Energy was here and they were talking about how there's this new incentive that they have made it a requirement that for every new federal grant they will give, it has to have a community component. So there has to be a partnership with community organizations on the ground. And I said, okay, that's great. I only see 3 community organizations on the ground, at least in Hidalgo County. Lupe, Arise, and Proyecto Azteca. So you're talking that you're going to bring billions of dollars to South Texas, and you're making everybody who have a requirement to work with community organizations. Is it going to be a meaningful partnership, or is it going to be a letter of support and we never hear from them again? And if it is a meaningful partnership, how are you helping support that organization? Because you're talking about billions of dollars. We're $4 million organization budget. Like, how are you going to help build capacity so that Lupe is able to handle those kind of federal grants? Now, the reality of things is that we also sue the federal and state government a lot. And so putting in jeopardy the sustainability of the program because the federal government may decide to pull funding out of us just because we sue them for, for things like suppressing the right to vote in Texas, right? And so there are things that we need to put into perspective. So we have found workarounds, okay? So if, for example, the university chooses to become the lead partner on this, then we work with the university. And then the university may subgrant Lupe to help bring community members or help. Maybe you are the ones that host the computer labs where Colonia residents can come, right? And then we connect and we do outreach for the Colonia residents. So there's ways to work around, but the immediate thought that community organizations out on the ground are going to have the capacity to sustain these kind of grants is not viable. that thought that Colonia residents themselves are going to be proactive when they literally have one car to try to get to school, work, pick up the kids. And so those are the things that we grapple with every single day. And we just need to put things in a balance. So I think that's when UTRGB was created. We hone in on really building a university that will have an embedded invested in the Colonias and embedded invested in working with Colonia residents. So that's why Lupe and Arise has partnered very closely with the university to be able to do this work. But we've done projects. We don't want to do projects. We want to do sustainable work that go beyond a grant. I tell people we're not going to hire anybody just because we hire you for a grant. When you come into the organization, you're coming into the fold of Lupe. And it is our responsibility as a leadership team to make sure there's sustainable funding, whether there's a grant or there isn't a grant for you. Because we are a community union that comes from the community, that works for the community, that is built by the community and the staff from the community. And so we want to make sure we're already like in the third iteration of like the legacy institution, Rebecca Flores being the first state director of the United Farm Workers, and then Juanita being executive director, and now me. And so we're already like in this third generation. We want to make sure this legacy institution continues, but it's not going to continue by just working within the system. It's going to continue by breaking apart the systems that we currently have.
Yeah, thank you. I know that when we early on in 2015, I see Lupe at all of our mission and visioning, and you, the whole organization. Well, you remember this. We would have these round tables, and there would be a round table about all the priorities that we had as an institution. And there was a Lupe or a RISE member at every single table, even in the athletics, they were there. And of course, there was a very vigorous dialogue about the mascot, the Vaqueros. We won't go into that, but
I'm a Brock all the way. Just saying.
Now, Christina, La Semilla was involved in at least one proposal for this particular call about the regional food business centers that we just mentioned. And I was wondering if you could discuss your first reaction to the announcement when you guys saw it come out as an organization that prioritizes food prosperity in your region. And then what was the eventual outcome of the involvement of La Semilla in any of the grant submissions?
So just for timeline, this is like November-ish of last year. And I think some of our community partners read the press release before I did, because I was getting calls. I got at least 4 calls one week, and it was from all femmes that were leading organizations in the region, and most were women of color. And so I say that because when you're listening to your community, if that's who's calling you, there is like, well, what's the moral mandate of the organization? Do we go for this? And it's like, I better sit down and read beyond the press release. And so I opened the notice of funding opportunity, and my eyes glazed over, as one does when you open any federal RFP, RFA, whatever. And I pulled up YouTube, and I was like, I'm visual. I need to hear it. And I'm listening to the intention of it, and I was like, cool, that it's meant to be for communities. I want to believe that. I went and opened the notice of funding again, and I was like, how is this accessible? How do we have the capacity to manage this? Like, and the calls we were getting to were from orgs that have had maybe like 1 federal grant. This is very recent for us, but we manage 5 right now, and that's the most we've ever had. That's a lot for us. And so what they said was, you all manage federal grants, you could do this, right? And this was like a whole other level of bureaucrat, like administration. So it was like, well, we can't hold this. But if the people are calling that I trust in, like, those are voices in our community, like, so what do we do with this? And so I was incubating that, and we're talking it over with staff. We were starting to get called. We got random emails, like, from across the country want to partner. And one of the calls I made was to Juan Raigosa here, and we had partnered, we were a sub-award a few years ago. And I left him a message, and it's just like, I have this feeling in my stomach. I don't know how to like pinpoint what it is, but I have really strong hesitations. But I also, like, do we want to be at the table? Do we want to create a new table? Like, it's this tension, and we're a 501c3, and I don't know who said this, and I wish I could credit them, but I rewrote it on my board, and it's like a 501c3 is not going to get us to liberation, but it is a tool. And so it's always like living with those two tools. Anyway, so the process, we engaged in a lot of heavy conversations, and then internally our team, I'm really glad. So when we did have like calls to people who were saying, "Do you want to partner?" and we couldn't respond to every single call, but I never attended those calls alone. It was with 3 or 4 staff. Because that's how we're practicing decision making, and to build power, right? It can't be concentrated in one person. And I'm really glad I did that too, because just a side note, I was going through a lot of like personal health emergency, but we had to decide. And so in that moment, I was like, this is validating because I had to like step back, but our team decided to go for it. Because I was thinking we need to do this, but it was also like, this is a huge 5-year commitment. If we get in, like, this is the easy part. It's the actual implementation. Is your community with you to hold it? So I'm gonna pause because I feel like I'm rambling, and it's like a whole thing for me. It was a hard process.
You know, you and I, and we engaged in several of these calls, because I can tell you, you know, UTRGV, as you guys all know, I mean, we're a young institution, and we are an institution that doesn't receive any specific federal funding for our food and agricultural programs. In fact, a lot of those universities are called land grant institutions. And if you read Hard Times, Hard Tomatoes, there's a really Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times. There's actually really very insightful description of how land grant institutions came to be. But you know, I mean, they were started in 1862, and they have this huge legacy of investment and investment in certain programs, and then of course involvement in both with federal investment and then also corporate investment. So they are these huge machines that have humongous budgets. And when it comes to like our program with the one that Juan Raigosa directs, I mean, we have very, very small budgets. I mean, you know, $4 million, we're not even half of that in terms of our center. And so when we see this call, for example, we knew we couldn't apply because you could only get $50 million. That was either you apply for something or you get $50 million as a lead institution, and we knew we didn't have the capacity for that. But we do see these opportunities of capacity building, and unfortunately, we also see it as an opportunity for others to advance their work. So these larger institutions, and that's kind of, we had these discussions internally as well. We see it as something that actually further drives disparity between our institutions, because all of a sudden these resource-rich institutions get another infusion of funds. And I won't tell you what happened, but we had a few of those institutions reach out to us, and they come to us and they say, hey, look, we would love for you. We know that you guys are doing some work in partnership with Colonias, and you guys are right there. You guys live in these regions. We want you to partner in our project. And we said, well, first of all, my name is Alex Rosellis. Let me introduce myself because I don't know who you are, right? And then you kind of don't get a couple of emails, and suddenly you get like kind of a one-page synopsis of what they want to do. We've had no input. We've had no communication with our partners, nor do we even go there yet because we don't even know what we're doing. We don't want to misrepresent our own partners. And then they come back and say, we have a budget for you for $300,000. And I say, well, hold on a minute. How much are you applying for? $50 million? And I know you laugh because a lot of us are in the same situation, right? And I can promise you that when we do decide to partner with these organizations, that UTRGV, that Lupe, La Semilla, we're in the first paragraph. because we are the organizations that are trying to do that work. So we have had just, and you know, I know that you've probably heard this before, Kate, but you know, our conversation today is to try and find ways to reconcile what is not reconcile, but just let's start conversations on how do organizations like ours, you know, the diversity of organizations that you see on the stage, how do we become more involved in these processes so that we can at least capture some of that opportunity to use our own wealth to do the mission of those programs? Because honestly, it's the wealth of these organizations that are really going to help towards prosperity in these areas in particular, right? UTRG, and in the same vein, we would never apply for a grant to do prosperity work in Appalachia. And yet we have universities in those areas reaching out to us to drive work in our colonias. I had one of my colleagues tell me, I didn't even know what a colonia was. But we put in for it. So it's just, we wanted to share with you some of these experiences, you know, more broadly. And I was wondering, Kate, if you had any insight or reaction to it, if you could share with us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'll start by saying I don't disagree with anything that's been said here. Absolutely not. Big institutions are imperfect. I'm speaking now of USDA. USDA is a big institution. I mean, it's got 100,000 staff all over the country. And there is rigidity. I think that there is not one answer to this question. And as a person hired to work on just one time-limited, I'm like a term-limited person. You know, I got just the 4 years, and to do this work. And what I can say is that in reference to this particular program, everything that could be done to ensure that organizations like your three or in the first paragraph was supposed to be in the RFA. It said, the RFA, you have to prove that organizations working with these historically underserved, led by BIPOC leaders, are informing the RFA. So putting that out there, which I think was new. In terms of the analysis, the proposals were read and reviewed by external, not our AMS staff, reviewers who were trained deeply in the RFA and in the particular perspective that this USDA administration has made in commitment to equity. And so, Alex, you're, for example, on the Equity Commission. So that framework was the training that the reviewers received. What the staff that are working on just the nuts and bolts of implementing this program are almost all non-USDA staff. We were hired from this, and we come almost exclusively from the nonprofit world, from more grassroots backgrounds. And I assume that was why we were hired, because the hope was that this program could be, a phrase that my boss used was, we were supposed to innovate within the government structures. So that's the mandate that we've been given. The way that we have tried to hew to the ideological, the equity approach has been, honestly, the first thing I looked at with these proposals was the budgets. Because I was, where's the money flowing, right? Where, because money is power. And there was a snafu in the fall. Staff had thought that we could limit the amount of overhead that the lead applicant organization charges. It turns out the USDA's lawyers told us that we were wrong, that institutions could charge higher rates. So that was a real hit to us, because we had hoped that by limiting the amount of administration, that more of a greater percentage of the funding that USDA would be pushing out would be going to the partner organizations that are doing the work on the ground. What I can say in terms of the commitment that we all have is to absolutely always be stalwart in holding. Actually, something that's different about this than the standard USDA grants is usually USDA gives money to just one organization. You know, here's your money and then the door is closed. These cooperative agreements required the lead organization to have a minimum of 2 partner organizations who have shared management of the work. And so the idea is that it's a collective that really is representative of the region that will be managing and overseeing all of the work. So the commitment that we are going to make is to try in every way we can within the legal structures that are given to us by a big government agency to ensure that that commitment to the funds flowing to the communities and the entities that will be most effective at affecting change in their communities and creating real economic development happens.
One of the proposals we ended up collaborating with, I just appreciate that lead institution did try and not take as much indirect, just a good faith effort that certainly helps to build towards that good faith effort. So I just want to acknowledge that, but can't really talk about it right now. And then I mentioned we do policy advocacy work. And so there's this constant tension, which is it worth it as a community-based organization to keep trying to secure these federal dollars, and yet we're doing policy advocacy work saying what little money you allocate to these programs. So Jim Hightower mentioned it's a farm bill year, like these tiny but mighty programs that could easily get cut that have been vital, like one-time cash infusions to launch our programs. So if we're advocating, like, don't cut these programs, and few organizations, community-based organizations in our region are applying for those federal dollars and we don't go for them, I don't know, it's just this tension of like, well, we say they're important and yet we don't want to mess with them. And so then our community won't get it. And so it's every single time there's like a federal funding opportunity, it's a health decision. Yeah. Like, what are the costs to your team and like navigating these institutions too? Like, what does it do to your bodies when you're having to sit in these meetings that aren't really meant for you? Not really. And it's our money, it's stolen labor, it's stolen land. So
Yeah. I live in a colonia now. I didn't used to live in a colonia. I live in south side. I'm still learning the colonia name. I grew up majority of my life here in Edinburgh, McAllen district, near the university, off Nolana. And so now that I live in a colonia, I'm like, damn, I gotta drive like 15 minutes to get to the nearest HEB, right? And 10 minutes to get to like Walmart. And I used to like roll out of bed and like get to Walmart in like 2 minutes. I appreciate that the federal government is trying to do these incentives and this work, but I also question, like, why is it that it has to be the work of the community to make sure we take healthy food to the colonias? Why is it that when HEB and Walmart come to our Hidalgo County Commissioner's course, to the city ordinances, why don't we restrict where they can set up their new Walmart, new HEB, to bring equity really to the colonias? Like, why is it that everybody in the cities gets to enjoy the big supermarket? I don't see, what is it called now, Sun Harvest, whatever that, Sprouts, right? Exactly, like, you know, I don't see a Sprouts in like the colonias. Why are we not building those kind of markets in the colonias? Like, really, that's what we need to be doing. So why is it that colonia residents have to grow their own crops, but everybody else in the city gets to go to the big supermarket? I don't see the equity in that.
You know, Tanya, we did a report recently to the TDA, Commission report on food access in Texas. and they wanted alternative options because a few years ago they tried to incentivize big box stores to build in other places. They even gave them like $1 million tax cut or some other bonus to say, hey, we want you to build in this colonia. But see, these big box stores, they know what their bottom line is, and it's not food access. You know, the bottom line is profit, and it's not. They're not. The reason why they don't build in a lot of our communities is because they're just not going to make money. You know, and this is the problem. This is part of the problem, right? And so they even told. I mean, we were instructed. Look, don't think about making those recommendations because we've made them before. We've tried other techniques to incentivize them. What are some other options you guys can imagine? One of the ones that came to the forefront after a series of discussions and interviews that we made all across the state, in rural areas, down here in the valley, was that community-based options are really the ones that could have some legacy. Because community-based options include values that big box stores don't. And so a big part of the summit also was to understand what these values are and to maybe think of a new system where that becomes a form of currency, right? And so that, you know, we want to feed our communities, we want to keep our farmers afloat, we want to have them, you know, some of these small farmers cannot sell to big box stores because they can't meet the scale and scope of those big box stores. So farmers, you know, that we have here in the communities that are really trying to provide food for communities in the valley, they're struggling. So we made that recommendation in the report, and we you know, there's still a lot of work to do legislatively on how to incentivize and how to actually encourage those kinds of efforts. We had a discussion about it yesterday, about cooperative models and community-based action, and we just, we at least had a beginning conversation about what that might look like and what it looks like for the folks who are doing some of that work.
And we used to have a cooperativa on the Lupa grounds. Many people don't know that, but the 10 acres behind our office used to be a cooperativa model, where like we would rent a lane and each family would grow their own crops and then they will pick everything up, but the issue was transportation, or being able to sell it to large corporations, or crops will go bad because we didn't have a high bidder that was willing to rotate the crops as they were getting picked, right? And so we just want to I just want to make sure that it's easy said to work with communities. I want to make sure we don't do a disservice to the community, right? And we want to make sure that if we're going to work with the community, we're actually supporting the community. We're saying, okay, no, big corporations are not willing to take the tax cuts. Okay, great. But I also don't see farmers markets in the colonias either. I mean, we're saying it's community-based, but I don't see the community going to colonias tampoco. So what is it going to be? Like, it's easy to say, no, it's the community, it's up to the community. And why are they not going to the colonias? Let's take that deep dive. They're not going to the colonias because there's no parks to go put your farmers market in the colonias. Why? Because colonias are not a priority, not for healthcare, not for food access, not for infrastructure. And so it's not just food access, it's everything else that surrounds the life of an individual to be able to provide health and support for them and their family.
Yeah, I'm totally, again, I agree with everything that's been said. One thing that comes to mind is that I think that there might be a piece of the business world that we've lost sight of, and that's small businesses. I mean, before the development of these huge, enormous, big box stores, there were locally owned grocery stores that people could walk to, and they were owned by families that lived in the neighborhood. And some of those stores still exist, and I think that they are enormously, potentially powerful partners for both communities that need food access, but also farmers that need to sell to markets. Because, yeah, it is inappropriate for a small farmer to sell to Walmart. It's just not going to work. It doesn't make sense for Walmart. It doesn't make sense for the small farmer. She'll be able to do much better if she can have a more direct relationship with a locally owned store that's closer. So thinking about the work through the lens of small business to small business, locally owned to locally owned, moving away from a concentrated system to a more diverse, competitive in a positive way, not a negative way, right? Small businesses that are rooted in a region so that they can take advantage of these synergies from coming and working together. And I think that's supposed to be at the heart of these regional food business centers. It's food business. So for example, your co-op, I remember the co-op, right? One of the things that could be done with this money would be, for example, to buy an aggregation, to build a shed, to buy a truck, so that the food could be aggregated and delivered to a local store. And I'm thinking about a conversation with you, Christina, about healthy food financing and the links that can happen, right, between small and mid-scale production and then connections to locally owned food retail.
I'm debating which thread to pick up because I know we're running out of time and there's so much to unpack. And thinking about, like, I guess food access, and we're talking about the purchasing of it, but also the informal exchange of food and growing in backyards. And I don't mean like romanticized. I mean like where you've been growing it for survival, and it's not like for marketing purposes. So I don't know, that thread's coming to mind, and I'm going to pause. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, we have some really stimulating questions from the audience, and if you had others, there's these little cards that you can just pass up. I'm going to ask a couple that are posed for you guys. So you guys highlighted a few of these disconnects between government agencies, community organizations, academic institutions, etc. But obviously, we need all of them to help combat some of these issues. So are there any concrete next steps that we can take, maybe we as in you, these organizations on the stage, to bridge those gaps, to organize, to provide resources for our communities, knowing that food security will only get worse, right? It's bad now, but it only get worse as we deal with pandemics, we deal with climate change, and so on. So that's a question for you, any of you guys.
I am not a policy person, but I am going to reiterate that it's a farm bill year. And so a large percentage of that farm bill is for food assistance programs that are always at risk. And I don't think that's the answer, but we can't afford to have that cut. So paying attention to farm bill advocacy that actually centers like anti-racist, pro-climate policies. And I'm going to lift up our comrades at the HEAL Alliance that has a platform for an equitable farm bill. So that's immediate. And then there's also very concrete things, but I want to make sure. Yeah.
So I think that the example that we were sharing earlier is something that can continue to be done in terms of the university being a tool. And really the university going back to its roots of wanting to be community center and think less of an academic institution only, but really being embedded into the community. I saw a UT Austin Center of Old 83. I don't see many UTRGV centers in our own communities, and the Colonias. I don't see every single staff member at the university when you come in being able to speak Spanish, right? So we start thinking about the institution as an extension of the resources that we can provide to the community, being able to, if we do get federal grants that you want the community to access, then using the university as a hub to be able to support those resources. And we can partner with community organizations so that we're letting community members know about these programs and compensate community organizations for that outreach, because we have to pay our staff too. But I think there's an opportunity there. But when the university only thinks of itself as an academic institution, it restricts what we can do as a community. And I'm not just calling to the university. There's also the community colleges. oftentimes we have been able to do greater work with school districts. Mr. Williams here lended out his tractor and staff and gardening supplies to build us a pond at Lupe many years ago. You know, there's partnerships that we can do with the institutions that we have, because you have the power. You already have a power as an institution. Nobody has to give you that. You don't have to ask for that. You already have the name brand.
Well, let me add to that, because I want to point out something that I've been advocating for myself, is that a lot of our institutions, especially those that are trying to be regionally centered and regionally anchored, we are falling farther and farther behind in terms of being under-resourced. And let me tell you exactly how that works. Is because these large land grant institutions, the big ones, right, 162-year head start, and every year they get funding directly from the federal government that is matched by each state. Some of it's disproportionate depending on which institution you are, but we'll get into that later. But they get these monies every year, $20 million from the Hatch Act. These are very, consistent monies that come in. And then when UTRGV tries to compete with those folks for a grant, for example, and we say, well, we would need some help to buy a refrigerated truck. And they were like, oh, no. I mean, when we get all these other proposals from other institutions, they're not asking for what you're asking for. They're asking for money that goes into programs. But how do we how do we staff our programs? How do we equip our staff to do the job? And it's because we don't, they have that money, that taxpayer dollars has already been spent, and those big institutions can buy the equipment already. They have them. So they don't write them into these soft-funded programs because they already have that wealth, right? And so it becomes harder for us to do some of that work. But what we can try to do is to leverage the wealth of our communities, right? And so I 100% agree with you that if we focus on not academics per se, but on the success of our students, which includes students from our colonias, because 40% of our students come from colonias, then we also have to focus on families and communities, because that is at the foundation of those students' success, right? They're at college because of their communities and their families. So I agree with you, because, and here's where you said something, Tanya, like you just have to create your own system, and breaking that system, I'll be honest, you can fight that system and we're never going to win. Why? Is because they already have a huge head start, right? It's a race that we shouldn't even run. We should create our own, right? We should create our own system and saying, well, and what is the currency we use? Well, we use trust. You can't buy that. We use, relationships and conversation. You can't buy that either, right? And so and in those ways, we actually can compete with these other organizations, and that's exactly why they reach out to us, right? These other institutions that try to give us $300,000 of a $50 million budget, they know that we have a wealth that they can't get. And so that's something we protect, and that's something that we honor. And I can speak on not necessarily on behalf of the entire university, but I can speak on behalf of our programs and our staff, like Juan and others who are doing this work, because I think we all realize that it's easy to focus on like saying, well, we just don't have enough. But instead of thinking in that deficit mindset, we say, hey, we actually have plenty, right? And how do we build on that plenty? And then here's the question, right, for this panel, is how do we marshal the resources of programs that are trying to be incrementally visionary, like the programs that Kate's running, and how do we actually marshal those to accelerate our work with our own platform? And that's the conversation that I was hoping that we can have today, and we can continue to have throughout the summit, and then of course beyond, right? So we are unfortunately at the end of the time of this session, but I'd like to take just a moment to thank all of you for joining. I hope that you have learned as much as I've learned, and you guys sharing all of your perspective and your worldview to the audience here in the room and also on the live stream. So please join me in thanking our panelists today.